My name is Maya Johnson, and if you had asked me a month ago what could possibly turn my trash bins into the biggest controversy in our neighborhood, I would have laughed. In Oakwood, people usually argued about things like parking spaces, holiday decorations, or whose dog barked too much. Nobody started neighborhood drama over garbage cans. At least that's what I thought. Every Wednesday morning, just like clockwork, I rolled my 2 trash bins to the curb before leaving for work. I had been doing the same thing for years. The city provided a simple set of rules, and I followed them carefully. The bins stayed behind my fence when not in use. They were placed at the curb on collection day. Then they went right back. It wasn't complicated, but across the street lived my neighbor, Narita Collins, and Narita had a remarkable talent for finding problems where most people saw none. One morning, while watering the flowers near my porch before heading to work, I noticed Narita standing at the end of her driveway holding her phone. First, I didn't think much of it. Then I realized she wasn't texting. She was taking pictures of my trash bins. I actually looked behind me to make sure there wasn't something else in the frame. There wasn't. She was photographing 2 perfectly ordinary city-issued trash cans. When she noticed me watching, she didn't seem embarrassed. In fact, she took another picture. Then another. Finally, I walked toward the curb and asked if everything was okay. Narita lowered her phone and smiled politely, the same smile she always used right before saying something irritating. "I'm just documenting a few concerns," she said. "Concerns about what?" I asked. She glanced at the bins. "Community standards." I almost laughed. Community standards? They were trash cans. They existed for the sole purpose of holding garbage. But Narita looked completely serious. Before I could ask another question, she turned around and headed back toward her house. I remember shaking my head and telling myself not to waste energy thinking about it. Narita complained about something every few months. Usually the issue disappeared as quickly as it arrived. For the next several days, life continued normally. I worked my shifts, walked Duke through the neighborhood, and spent my evenings relaxing on the porch. If Narita was still upset about my trash bins, I certainly didn't know about it. Then the envelope arrived. It showed up in my mailbox on a Friday afternoon. The return address belonged to the City Code Enforcement Department. The moment I saw those words, my stomach tightened. Most people don't receive letters from City Code Enforcement unless something has gone wrong. Standing in my kitchen, I carefully opened the envelope and began reading. According to the notice, a complaint had been filed regarding improper trash bin placement and possible violations of city property maintenance regulations. The city intended to conduct an inspection. For several seconds I simply stared at the page. Then I read it again. Improper trash bin placement? Possible violations? I couldn't understand it. I followed the rules. My bins were exactly where they were supposed to be. The entire situation felt absurd. Yet the letter was real. The inspection date was listed. The complaint had been officially recorded. Someone had taken the issue far beyond neighborhood gossip. A few minutes later, I walked outside and sat on my porch trying to process everything. Across the street, Narita was trimming flowers near her mailbox. The timing felt too perfect to be a coincidence. She looked up briefly, saw the envelope in my hand, and quickly looked away. That was all the confirmation I needed. She had done this. What I didn't understand was why. What could she possibly gain from reporting someone over trash bins? As I sat there wondering, Mr. Harrison slowly approached from down the sidewalk. The retired history teacher had lived in Oakwood longer than almost anyone else. He noticed the expression on my face immediately. After I showed him the notice, he adjusted his glasses and let out a low whistle. "Well," he said, "someone really wanted the city involved." I told him about Narita taking pictures earlier that week. He wasn't surprised. "She's been talking about those bins for months," he admitted. "Mostly to anyone willing to listen." That revelation shocked me even more. Months? I had no idea she had been discussing my trash cans behind my back. Mr. Harrison sat beside me and looked toward Narita's house. "The funny thing is," he said, "people who spend all their time looking for problems usually find something they weren't expecting." At the time, I thought he was simply trying to make me feel better. Neither of us knew how right he was. Because 3 days later, a city inspector named Daniel Brooks would arrive in Oakwood to investigate a complaint about trash bins. And before his visit was over, He would discover something that had absolutely nothing to do with garbage cans, and everything to do with a secret hidden in plain sight for years. 3 days later, I found myself standing on my front porch waiting for a city inspector, because my neighbor didn't like where I put my trash bins. Even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. The inspection was scheduled for 10 o'clock on a Monday morning, and by 9:30 I had already checked the city guidelines twice just to make sure I hadn't missed something obvious. The bins were exactly where they should be. They had always been exactly where they should be. Still, when an official inspection is involved, doubt has a way of sneaking into your mind. Maybe I misunderstood a rule. Maybe there was some regulation I had never heard of. Across the street, Narita seemed unusually interested in her front yard that morning. She watered the same flower bed 3 different times. Every few minutes she glanced toward my house. She wasn't trying to hide it. In fact, it almost felt like she wanted me to know she was watching. At exactly 10 o'clock, a white city vehicle turned onto Oakwood Drive and parked in front of my house. The words City Code Enforcement were printed on the side. A tall man stepped out carrying a clipboard and a tablet. He introduced himself as Daniel Brooks and immediately struck me as someone who preferred facts over opinions. He wasn't interested in neighborhood gossip. He wasn't interested in personal disagreements. He simply wanted to do his job. I appreciated that. After a brief introduction, I showed him the location of the trash bins. Daniel took several measurements, checked property markers, reviewed city regulations on his tablet, and carefully documented everything. The entire process was surprisingly thorough. Meanwhile, Narita remained across the street pretending to trim bushes while clearly trying to overhear every word. After about 20 minutes, Daniel looked up from his notes. "Ms. Johnson," he said, "as far as I can see, your trash bins are fully compliant with city regulations." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "So there's no violation?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "Not that I've found." For a moment I thought the entire ordeal was over. I imagined Narita receiving a polite letter explaining that her complaint had been investigated and dismissed. I imagined life returning to normal. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of heading back to his vehicle, Daniel remained standing near the curb. His eyes moved slowly down the street. He wasn't looking at my house anymore. He wasn't looking at my bins. He was studying something farther away. At first, I couldn't tell what had caught his attention. Then I noticed him focusing on a row of properties near the end of the block. His expression changed slightly. Not alarmed. Curious. The kind of look someone gets when a puzzle piece doesn't seem to fit. Daniel opened his tablet again and compared something on the screen with what he was seeing in real life. A few seconds later, he walked several steps into the street for a better angle. I followed his gaze but still couldn't understand what he was looking at. "Everything okay?" I asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he zoomed in on something using his tablet. Finally, he said, "Probably nothing." But his tone suggested otherwise. Across the street, Narita seemed to notice the change as well. She straightened up and watched him carefully. For the first time all morning, she looked uncertain. Daniel returned to his vehicle, thanked me for my cooperation, and started organizing his paperwork. I assumed he was about to leave. Then he paused. He looked once more toward the far end of the neighborhood before writing a note on his clipboard. It was a small action, but something about it caught my attention. Inspectors don't usually continue taking notes after closing a case. As Daniel prepared to drive away, Mr. Harrison appeared from his morning walk. He greeted me, nodded politely toward the city vehicle, and asked how the inspection had gone. I explained that there were no violations. "That's good," he said. Then he glanced down the street and noticed where Daniel had been looking. A strange expression crossed his face. It disappeared so quickly that I almost missed it. "Interesting," he murmured. "What's interesting?" I asked. Mr. Harrison hesitated for a moment before shrugging. "Probably nothing." It was the second time I'd heard those exact words in less than 10 minutes. Later that afternoon, I tried to put the whole situation behind me. The complaint had been dismissed. The city found no problem. Case closed. Or so I thought. Then, just before sunset, I saw the same white city code enforcement vehicle drive slowly back into Oakwood. This time it didn't stop near my house. It continued toward the far end of the neighborhood where Daniel had been staring earlier that morning. And instead of leaving after a few minutes, the vehicle remained there for nearly an hour. Standing on my porch, I watched the inspector move between several properties, taking photographs and making notes. Whatever had caught his attention during my inspection clearly hadn't been forgotten. The strange part was that none of it had anything to do with my trash bins anymore. Somehow, Narita's complaint had led the city inspector to something completely different. And judging by the serious look on Daniel's face as he worked, whatever he had discovered was far more important than where someone stored their garbage cans. By the next morning, nearly everyone in Oakwood knew that a city inspector had visited our neighborhood. News traveled fast on our street, sometimes faster than the internet. The difference this time was that the rumors weren't focused on me anymore. At least not entirely. Several neighbors had noticed the city code enforcement vehicle returning later that afternoon and spending nearly an hour at the far end of the block. Nobody seemed to know why. And when people don't have answers, they start creating their own. During my morning walk with Duke, I overheard 3 different theories before I even reached the neighborhood entrance. One person believed the city was investigating illegal construction. Another was convinced someone had filed multiple complaints throughout the neighborhood. A third thought the city was planning new property regulations. Meanwhile, Narita appeared more confident than ever. She stood outside talking with several residents and seemed unusually eager to discuss city inspections. Every time my name came up, she conveniently mentioned how important it was for communities to maintain standards. She never directly accused me of anything anymore, because the inspector had already cleared my property. Instead, she spoke in vague generalities that allowed people to draw their own conclusions. It was a clever strategy. Annoying but clever. Around lunchtime, I spotted the white city code enforcement vehicle again. This time Daniel Brooks wasn't near my house. He was parked 2 streets over reviewing documents inside his vehicle. Curiosity finally got the better of me. I walked over and greeted him. To my surprise, he seemed happy to see me. "Good afternoon, Miss Johnson," he said. "Everything still okay with the bins?" I laughed. Apparently my bins are the most thoroughly inspected trash cans in Oakwood. Even Daniel smiled at that. Then I asked the question everyone in the neighborhood wanted answered. "Can I ask what you're investigating now?" Daniel hesitated. I probably shouldn't discuss an active review. That answer wasn't surprising. What did surprise me was what happened next. As he organized some paperwork, a rolled-up site map partially slid from a folder on his passenger seat. For only a second I caught a glimpse of it. But it was enough to notice several red markings drawn around a property near the end of our street. Daniel quickly tucked the map away. He hadn't done anything wrong, and neither had I. Still, the brief glimpse told me one important thing. Whatever he was investigating, it was focused on a specific property. Not the entire neighborhood. Not random inspections. One location. That evening, Mr. Harrison stopped by my porch carrying 2 cups of coffee. Whenever he showed up with coffee, it usually meant he had been thinking about something. After I told him about my conversation with Daniel, he grew thoughtful. "You know," he said, staring down the street, "there's a lot of history buried in this neighborhood." I smiled. "You say that like you're about to tell me a ghost story." He chuckled. "Nothing quite that dramatic." Then his expression became serious. But Oakwood wasn't built all at once. Different sections were developed at different times. Different builders. Different permits. Different property boundaries. I wasn't sure where he was going with this. Neither was he, apparently. He admitted that he couldn't remember all the details. Most of those records were decades old. But something about Daniel's investigation seemed familiar to him, like a memory sitting just beyond reach. Before leaving, Mr. Harrison said something strange. If the city is looking at old records, they may find things nobody has thought about in years. Later that night, I sat on my porch watching the sunset while Duke slept beside me. Across the street, Narita was speaking on her phone. Even from a distance, I could tell she was animated, excited. Every few moments she gestured toward different houses in the neighborhood. It looked almost as if she were discussing the investigation. Then something unexpected happened. A dark sedan pulled up near the end of the block. A man stepped out carrying a large tube of rolled documents and walked directly toward Daniel Brooks, who was waiting beside another city vehicle. The two men spent nearly 30 minutes reviewing papers under a portable light. I couldn't hear a single word they said, but I could see enough to know this wasn't routine. Maps were unfolded. Measurements were discussed. Notes were taken. The deeper they looked, the more serious the conversation appeared to become. When they finally packed everything away, Daniel remained standing alone for several moments staring toward one particular property. Even from a distance, his body language told the story. He had found something. The next morning, Oakwood would wake up to another rumor. But this one would be different, because for the first time the city wasn't asking questions about trash bins anymore. They were asking questions about paperwork. And somewhere inside a set of old property records was an answer that nobody, including Narita, was prepared to hear. By the end of the week, Narita had completely changed her strategy. When the city inspector first arrived, she seemed thrilled to tell anyone who would listen that Maya Johnson had finally been reported. But after Daniel Brooks cleared my property and continued investigating something else, the story became harder for her to control. That didn't stop her from trying. In fact, she doubled down. One afternoon, I was planting flowers near my porch when I overheard Narita speaking with a small group of neighbors across the street. She wasn't mentioning me by name anymore, but she kept bringing up the importance of enforcing community standards. Every few minutes, she would glance toward my house as if hoping someone would connect the dots for themselves. A few residents nodded politely. Others looked unconvinced. The problem for Narita was simple. The city had already inspected my property and found nothing wrong. Yet she continued acting as though some major violation had been uncovered. Meanwhile, Daniel Brooks was becoming a familiar sight in Oakwood. His vehicle appeared almost daily. Sometimes he spent hours reviewing documents. Other times he walked around the same section of the neighborhood carrying maps and measuring equipment. The more people saw him, the more speculation spread. By now, everyone knew something unusual was happening. They just didn't know what. One evening, while walking Duke, I passed Sophia sitting alone on a bench near the community entrance. She looked distracted. After exchanging greetings, she surprised me by asking a question I hadn't expected. "Do you think my mom ever knows when she's gone too far?" For a moment, I didn't know how to answer. Sophia rarely spoke negatively about Narita. In fact, she usually defended her. The fact that she was asking at all told me how uncomfortable she had become. I chose my words carefully. I think most people don't realize they've gone too far until something forces them to stop and look around. Sophia stared at the ground. I don't think she expected any of this. Neither did I. At that exact moment, Narita was probably still celebrating the fact that she had brought the city into the neighborhood. What she didn't understand was that the investigation now seemed to have a life of its own. The following morning brought another unexpected development. Mr. Harrison knocked on my door carrying a folder. The retired teacher looked unusually excited. "I remembered something," he announced before I could even offer him coffee. We sat on the porch while he explained. Decades earlier, when Oakwood was still being developed, portions of the neighborhood had gone through multiple ownership changes. Different builders had purchased and sold parcels of land. Some projects had been delayed. Others had been modified. Over the years, records became scattered between city departments and private contractors. Most of it never mattered, Mr. Harrison explained. Until now. He opened the folder and showed me several copies of old neighborhood maps. I wasn't an expert in property records, but even I could see that some of the layouts looked different from today's neighborhood. Streets had shifted. Property lines had changed. Certain structures shown on the maps no longer existed. "Do you think that's what Daniel is looking at?" I asked. Mr. Harrison shrugged. "It's possible." Then he pointed toward one section highlighted in yellow. "What's interesting is that the records don't all agree with each other." That sentence stayed with me long after he left. Later that afternoon, I saw Daniel again. This time he wasn't walking through the neighborhood. He was standing beside his vehicle studying a large blueprint spread across the hood. Another city employee stood next to him. From a distance, I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could tell they were focused on a specific location. Every few moments, one of them would point toward the same area near the end of the block. Eventually, the second employee left. Daniel remained alone. He looked at the blueprint, then looked toward the neighborhood, then back at the blueprint again. Suddenly, he reached for his phone and made a call. Whatever he had found appeared significant enough to involve someone else. That evening, Narita hosted a small gathering in her backyard. Several neighbors attended. Music played softly. People chatted near the patio. Yet even from my porch, I noticed something unusual. The conversation kept drifting back to the city investigation. Narita was still trying to steer the narrative. Still trying to convince everyone that the neighborhood needed stricter oversight. But the more she talked, the more uncertain she seemed. It was subtle. Most people probably wouldn't have noticed. I did. Because for the first time since this entire situation began, Narita no longer looked like someone in control of the story. She looked like someone trying to keep up with it. Then just before sunset, something happened that changed everything. A city records technician arrived in Oakwood carrying a large archival tube filled with old documents. He met Daniel near the property they had been studying all week. Together, they unrolled a massive site plan on a folding table and began comparing it with current records. Nearly an hour passed. Then Daniel suddenly stopped writing. He stared at one section of the document for several seconds. Even from across the street, I could see the change in his expression. It was the look of someone who had finally found the missing piece of a puzzle. The next day, he would request a meeting with city officials. And hidden inside one forgotten set of records was a discrepancy so significant that it would soon send shockwaves through the entire neighborhood. The following week began with an unusual tension hanging over Oakwood. People could feel that something was changing, even if they didn't yet know what it was. Daniel Brooks was no longer making casual visits or taking routine measurements. His investigation had clearly entered a different phase. Every time his city vehicle appeared, neighbors peeked through windows or slowed their morning walks to watch. The rumors had become impossible to ignore. Some residents believed an illegal construction project had been uncovered. Others thought the city was preparing to issue major fines. Meanwhile, Narita continued acting as though the entire situation started because she had been protecting neighborhood standards. The irony was that nobody seemed interested in discussing trash bins anymore. The original complaint, the one that had brought Daniel to Oakwood in the first place, had become almost irrelevant. One Tuesday afternoon, I returned home from work and found Mr. Harrison waiting on my porch. The moment I saw the expression on his face, I knew he had news. "You're not going to believe this," he said as soon as I sat down. Earlier that day, he had visited the local records office to satisfy his growing curiosity. The retired teacher had always loved history, and Daniel's investigation had awakened something in him. While reviewing old neighborhood documents, he discovered references to a development plan from nearly 25 years earlier. According to those records, several lots in Oakwood had been modified during construction. Most of the changes were minor. One wasn't. Mr. Harrison explained that a section of property near the end of our street appeared very different in the original plans compared to what existed today. Different how? I asked. He opened a folder and showed me photocopies of old maps. Even without understanding every technical detail, I could see that something wasn't lining up. A structure that existed today seemed significantly larger than the one shown on the approved plans. The difference wasn't small. It wasn't the kind of thing someone would overlook accidentally. Maybe the plans were updated later, I suggested. Mr. Harrison nodded. That's exactly what I thought. Then he pointed to another document. But nobody can find an approved revision. A chill ran through me. Suddenly, Daniel's constant visits made much more sense. This wasn't about maintenance codes anymore. It wasn't even about neighborhood complaints. This was about property records, permits, and a discrepancy that had somehow gone unnoticed for decades. That evening, I walked Duke past the area Daniel had been studying all week. Nothing looked unusual. The homes were beautiful. The lawns were perfectly maintained. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. It was hard to imagine that one of these properties might be at the center of a major city investigation. Yet somewhere among those houses was the answer Daniel had been chasing. The next morning provided another clue. Around 10 o'clock, 2 additional city vehicles arrived in Oakwood. Unlike Daniel, these officials weren't carrying measuring equipment. They carried folders. Lots of them. For nearly 3 hours, they met inside the community center reviewing maps, permits, and historical records. By lunchtime, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Narita seemed especially interested. I spotted her walking near the community center twice, clearly trying to learn what was happening. For the first time since this ordeal began, she looked less confident than curious, maybe even concerned. Later that afternoon, Sophia stopped by while I was working in the garden. She looked distracted. After a few minutes of small talk, she lowered her voice. My mom's been talking about the investigation non-stop. I wasn't surprised. What does she think they're looking at? Sophia sighed. That's the weird part. She doesn't know anymore. That answer stuck with me. For weeks, Narita had acted as though she understood exactly what was happening. Now even she seemed lost. As the sun began setting, another development occurred. Daniel returned to the neighborhood carrying a thick stack of documents. He met with the city records technician again. This time they worked outside where several residents could see them. Large maps covered a folding table. Historical permits were spread across the surface. At one point, Daniel placed a finger on a specific address and exchanged a long look with the technician. Neither man said much. They didn't need to. Their expressions told the story. They had finally confirmed something important. Something significant enough that Daniel immediately picked up his phone and made another call. Nearly everyone watching sensed the same thing at that moment. The investigation was no longer about discovering whether a problem existed. It was about determining how big that problem actually was. And before the night was over, Daniel would receive the final document he needed. The document that identified the owner of the property connected to the discrepancy. The moment that name appeared on the page, the entire direction of the story changed. The next morning, Oakwood woke up to a rumor so widespread that it seemed impossible to avoid. By breakfast, people were already discussing it on front porches. By lunchtime, it had reached every corner of the neighborhood. The city had identified the property connected to the discrepancy. Nobody knew the address yet, but everyone knew a decision was coming. Even those who normally ignored neighborhood gossip were paying attention. As for me, I was mostly trying to understand how a complaint about trash bins had somehow evolved into one of the largest investigations our community had seen in years. That question stayed with me as I watered the flowers in my front yard. Across the street, Narita appeared unusually restless. She walked in and out of her house several times that morning, checking her phone constantly. Gone was the confident woman who had proudly talked about community standards and rule enforcement. In her place was someone who looked increasingly uncomfortable with how much attention the investigation was receiving. Around noon, Daniel Brooks returned to Oakwood carrying a large folder under his arm. This time he wasn't alone. 2 additional city officials accompanied him. The 3 of them walked directly to the community center and disappeared inside. The sight immediately attracted attention. Neighbors began gathering nearby, pretending to take walks or check their mail while trying to figure out what was happening. Even Mr. Harrison admitted he had never seen this level of city involvement over a neighborhood issue. Something significant was unfolding behind those doors. Several hours later, Daniel finally emerged. He looked exhausted but satisfied, like someone who had spent weeks assembling a difficult puzzle and had finally found the last missing piece. Before leaving, he stopped to speak briefly with Mr. Harrison and me. Although he couldn't discuss details, he did reveal one important fact. The discrepancy involved a structure that had existed for many years, longer than anyone initially believed. How long? Mr. Harrison asked. Daniel hesitated. Long enough that most current residents probably assume it's always been there. That answer sent my imagination racing. A structure? Not a fence. Not landscaping. Something larger. Something permanent. As Daniel drove away, Mr. Harrison became unusually quiet. We sat together on my porch for nearly 20 minutes before he finally spoke. I think I know what they're looking at. My heart skipped a beat. He explained that during Oakwood's early development, one property near the end of the neighborhood underwent several changes during construction. At the time, the modifications seemed harmless. Nobody paid much attention because the development company was constantly adjusting plans. But according to old records, one particular addition may never have received final approval. You think the city just discovered this now? I asked. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. If the paperwork was buried deeply enough, it's possible. The more we discussed it, the stranger the situation became. How could a significant discrepancy remain hidden for decades? How could multiple property sales occur without anyone noticing? And why had it taken a complaint about trash bins to uncover it? Later that afternoon, another unexpected development occurred. Sophia knocked on my door. The moment I saw her face, I knew something was wrong. She looked worried, more worried than I had ever seen her. After stepping onto the porch, she immediately asked if I had heard any updates about the investigation. I told her what little I knew. She listened carefully before lowering her voice. My mom's been making calls all day. That caught my attention. Calls to who? Sophia shook her head. I don't know. But she seems nervous. For the first time, I began wondering whether Narita knew more than she was letting on. Not because she was involved in whatever the city had discovered, but because she might have realized the investigation was heading somewhere she never expected. After Sophia left, I looked across the street. Narita was standing in her driveway speaking rapidly into her phone. Her expression wasn't smug anymore. It wasn't confident. It looked alarmed. The sight stayed with me throughout the evening. Then, just before sunset, the biggest clue yet appeared. A city vehicle stopped outside the property Daniel had been studying for weeks. One official stepped out and attached a temporary notice near the structure in question. The notice wasn't visible from where I stood, but the reaction from nearby residents told me everything I needed to know. Conversations stopped. People stared. Several neighbors immediately pulled out their phones. Within minutes, word began spreading through Oakwood. The city had officially identified the source of the discrepancy. The investigation was no longer theoretical. It was real. And by the following evening, everyone would learn the address connected to the violation. What nobody knew yet was that the property belonged to someone far closer to the story than anyone had imagined. When that address was finally revealed, the entire neighborhood would fall silent. By the following evening, Oakwood felt less like a quiet suburban neighborhood and more like a town waiting for a verdict. People who normally spent their evenings indoors were suddenly outside. Small groups gathered near mailboxes, sidewalks, and front porches. Every conversation eventually led back to the same topic: the city investigation. Nobody knew the full story yet, but everyone sensed that something important was about to happen. I was sitting on my porch with Duke resting beside me when Mr. Harrison walked over carrying a folded piece of paper. The look on his face immediately caught my attention. It wasn't excitement. It wasn't concern. It was disbelief. The kind of expression someone wears when reality turns out to be stranger than expected. Without saying a word, he handed me the paper. It was a public notice from the city regarding a property review. Most of the language was technical and difficult to follow, but one detail stood out immediately: an address. I read it once. Then I read it again. Surely I had misunderstood. That's the address? I asked. Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. That's the address. My eyes drifted toward the far end of Oakwood where the property sat. It wasn't some abandoned building. It wasn't a forgotten lot. It belonged to one of the most well-maintained homes in the entire neighborhood. A house people often pointed to as an example of how property should be maintained. The irony was almost impossible to ignore. For weeks, residents had been discussing community standards because of a complaint about my trash bins. Now the city's largest concern involved one of the neighborhood's most admired properties. Within hours, the news spread. By sunset, nearly everyone knew the address connected to the discrepancy. Reactions ranged from confusion to complete shock. Several residents insisted there had to be a mistake. Others couldn't believe the city had overlooked the issue for so many years. Meanwhile, Narita seemed unusually quiet. For perhaps the first time since I had known her, she wasn't leading conversations. She wasn't offering opinions. She wasn't explaining what should happen next. Instead, she stayed inside most of the evening with her curtains drawn. That alone felt significant. Around 8 o'clock, Sophia appeared at my front gate. She looked exhausted. After checking to make sure nobody else was nearby, she stepped onto the porch. "Everyone's talking about it," she said softly. I nodded. "That's usually what happens around here." She attempted a smile but couldn't quite manage it. Then she said something that immediately grabbed my attention. "My mom knows that address." For a moment I thought I had misheard her. What do you mean? Sophia sat down and looked toward the street. A few years ago, there was a conversation about that property at an HOA meeting. I remember because my mom talked about it afterward. My pulse quickened. What did she say? Sophia frowned, trying to remember. Something about permits. Something about old construction records. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, several pieces of the puzzle began fitting together. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to raise new questions. If Narita recognized the address, then perhaps she understood the significance of the investigation before most of the neighborhood did. Maybe that explained why she had become so nervous during the past few days. Maybe she had realized where the city's attention was heading. Later that night, another rumor swept through Oakwood. This one came directly from residents who had attended a meeting with city officials earlier in the day. According to them, the discrepancy wasn't minor. It wasn't a paperwork error. It wasn't a missing signature. The structure connected to the investigation had apparently been expanded far beyond what the original permits allowed. Worse still, no approved revision could be found anywhere in the city's archives. If true, the implications were enormous. Suddenly, the question wasn't whether a violation existed. The question was how nobody had discovered it sooner. Around 10 o'clock, I stepped outside one final time before bed. The neighborhood was unusually quiet. Most homes had turned off their lights, but one house remained brightly illuminated. Narita's. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see her pacing across the living room while speaking on the phone. She looked frustrated, worried, maybe even scared. It was a dramatic change from the woman who had confidently photographed my trash bins just a few weeks earlier. As I watched, she stopped pacing and sat down heavily on the couch. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the floor. Then she buried her face in her hands. Whatever was happening, it had clearly become much bigger than she ever intended. The following morning, the HOA would announce an emergency community meeting. City officials would attend. Daniel Brooks would present his findings. And for the first time, the entire neighborhood would hear exactly what the investigation had uncovered. But the biggest surprise wasn't the violation itself. The biggest surprise was the name connected to the property. Because when Daniel finally revealed the ownership history, everyone in the room, including Narita, would realize that this story was far from over. The emergency HOA meeting drew a larger crowd than any community event I could remember. By the time I arrived, nearly every chair inside the community center was occupied. Some residents stood along the walls. Others gathered outside near the windows hoping to hear what was being said. The atmosphere felt completely different from the casual neighborhood meetings we were used to. There were no discussions about landscaping budgets or holiday decorations. Everyone had come for one reason. They wanted answers. At the front of the room sat Daniel Brooks and two city officials. Several large maps were displayed on presentation boards behind them. Property records, construction plans, and aerial photographs covered the tables. The amount of documentation alone made it obvious that this investigation had grown far beyond a simple complaint. As I took my seat, I noticed Narita sitting several rows ahead. She wasn't speaking to anyone. She wasn't smiling. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor while nervously tapping her fingers against a folder in her lap. Sophia sat beside her, looking equally uncomfortable. For the first time since this entire situation began, Narita looked less like someone attending a meeting and more like someone awaiting a diagnosis. When the room finally settled, the HOA president stood and thanked everyone for coming. He explained that the city had requested the opportunity to present findings related to an ongoing property review. Then he turned the floor over to Daniel. The city inspector rose from his chair and walked toward the display boards. His calm demeanor hadn't changed, but there was a seriousness in his voice that immediately captured everyone's attention. He began by reviewing the timeline. Several weeks earlier, city code enforcement had received a complaint regarding trash bin placement. A few people glanced in my direction. Daniel acknowledged that the original complaint had been investigated and found to be unfounded. That should have been the end of the matter. But during the inspection, something else caught his attention. He pointed to an aerial photograph displayed on one of the boards. The image showed a section of Oakwood near the end of our street. Daniel explained how certain measurements visible on the property didn't appear consistent with historical records. That observation led to additional reviews. Those reviews led to archived permits. The archived permits led to original development plans. And eventually, the city uncovered a discrepancy that had somehow remained hidden for decades. The room grew quieter with every sentence. Daniel carefully walked everyone through the evidence. He displayed copies of original site plans. Then he showed updated aerial photographs. Finally, he revealed side-by-side comparisons highlighting the differences. Even residents with no experience in construction could see that something didn't match. A large addition attached to a property today appeared significantly larger than anything approved in the original plans. Several people exchanged confused looks. Others leaned forward in their seats. One neighbor raised his hand and asked the obvious question. How could this happen without anyone noticing? Daniel explained that the neighborhood had changed ownership multiple times over the years. Builders came and went. Records were archived. Personnel changed. At some point, documentation stopped matching reality. Once the discrepancy became buried deep enough in old files, nobody had reason to revisit it. Until now. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Daniel turned to a final board displaying ownership records connected to the property. The room became so quiet that I could hear the hum of the air conditioner overhead. Several residents instinctively leaned closer. Narita slowly looked up for the first time all evening. Daniel explained that determining responsibility had been complicated because ownership had changed hands more than once. The city wasn't interested in assigning blame for decisions made decades earlier. They were interested in establishing facts. He paused before continuing. The structure currently under review, he said, is connected to a property with a unique ownership history. Every eye in the room focused on him. Then Daniel displayed the final record. A murmur spread through the audience almost immediately. Confusion, surprise, disbelief. I watched expressions change throughout the room as people read the information for themselves. Some looked toward the back of the room. Others turned toward one another. A few simply stared at the screen. Then I looked at Narita. The color drained from her face. Whatever appeared on that document was something she clearly recognized. Sophia noticed it too. She turned toward her mother with a look of concern. Narita's hands tightened around the folder in her lap. For several seconds she didn't move at all. Daniel continued speaking, but many people were no longer listening. They were trying to process what they had just learned. The ownership history connected the property to a decision made years earlier. One that suddenly explained why certain records never matched. More importantly, it revealed that the situation was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. What began as a complaint about trash bins had now uncovered a chain of decisions stretching back decades. As the meeting entered a short recess, conversations erupted throughout the room. Residents whispered. Questions flew in every direction. The investigation had finally reached its turning point. But Daniel wasn't finished. He still had one final conclusion to present. And when that conclusion was revealed, the entire neighborhood would understand exactly who had been wrong, who had been right, and why this story never should have started with a complaint about trash bins in the first place. When the HOA meeting resumed, the energy in the room had completely changed. Earlier, people had arrived expecting to hear about a code violation. Now they were sitting on the edge of their seats trying to understand how a complaint about trash bins had uncovered a decades-old property discrepancy. Conversations died down as Daniel Brooks returned to the front of the room. He waited until the room became quiet before continuing. "I'd like to clarify one important point," he said. "The purpose of this investigation was never to punish residents. Our responsibility is to verify facts and ensure public records accurately reflect existing conditions." That statement seemed to calm some people, but everyone was still waiting for the answer to the biggest question. Who was actually responsible? Daniel displayed one final document on the screen. It was a timeline showing the property's ownership history over the past 25 years. As he walked through the information, a clearer picture began to emerge. The unauthorized expansion had not been built by the current owner. In fact, it predated several ownership transfers. The structure had changed hands multiple times before eventually becoming part of the property everyone recognized today. A wave of relief visibly moved through parts of the audience. This wasn't a story about someone secretly breaking rules in recent years. It was a story about an old discrepancy that had quietly followed the property through decades of transactions. Then Daniel revealed the city's conclusion. After reviewing all available evidence, inspectors found no indication that the current owner knowingly violated regulations. However, the records would need to be corrected, permits updated, and several administrative issues resolved to bring everything into compliance. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then someone asked the question many people were thinking. So all of this started because of a complaint about trash bins? A few residents laughed awkwardly. Even Daniel smiled slightly. Yes, he admitted. Without the original complaint, this discrepancy may have remained undiscovered for many more years. The irony was impossible to ignore. Narita had spent weeks trying to prove that I wasn't following the rules. Instead, the investigation had exposed a completely unrelated issue buried deep within city archives. More importantly, it had shown that assumptions can send people looking in one direction, while the truth waits somewhere else entirely. As discussion continued, several neighbors began reflecting on how quickly rumors had spread. Some admitted they initially assumed I had done something wrong simply because an official complaint existed. Others acknowledged that they never questioned the accusations because they trusted the confidence with which they were presented. Listening to those conversations was strangely validating. Not because anyone was apologizing to me directly, but because people were recognizing how easily assumptions can become accepted as facts. Then something unexpected happened. Narita stood up. The room immediately became quiet. She looked nervous, which was unusual enough by itself. For a moment, she seemed unsure whether to speak at all. Finally, she took a deep breath. I owe Maya an apology. Several people looked surprised. I certainly was. Narita admitted that she had become so focused on what she believed was a problem that she never stopped to consider whether a problem actually existed. She had assumed she was helping the neighborhood. Instead, she contributed to weeks of tension and speculation. Her voice wasn't dramatic. There were no excuses. No attempts to justify her actions. Just a straightforward acknowledgement that she had been wrong. Across the room, Sophia looked relieved. Mr. Harrison smiled quietly beside me. As for me, I wasn't interested in embarrassing Narita or extending the conflict. The truth had already done what it needed to do. So when everyone turned to look at me, I simply nodded and accepted the apology. The tension in the room seemed to dissolve almost immediately. For the first time since this entire situation began, the neighborhood felt united again rather than divided. By the end of the meeting, people were discussing solutions instead of accusations. The city would work with the property owner to correct historical records. The HOA would review communication procedures to reduce unnecessary conflicts. Life would move forward. As residents slowly filed out of the community center, many stopped to chat with one another. Some laughed about how absurd the situation had become. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A few even joked that Oakwood's most famous trash bins deserved a historical marker. Walking home that evening, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. Duke trotted happily beside me, completely unaware that he had spent the last month living in the middle of a neighborhood mystery. Across the street, Narita stood in her driveway watching the sunset. For a moment our eyes met. Neither of us said anything. We didn't need to. The story was finally over. Or at least that's what I thought. Because the next morning, an unexpected letter would arrive at my house, one that would turn this strange chapter into a lesson the entire neighborhood would remember for years. The next morning, I expected life to return to normal. After weeks of complaints, inspections, rumors, meetings, and endless speculation, Oakwood finally seemed ready to move on. The city had presented its findings. The records would be corrected. The conflict was over. At least, that's what I believed when I walked outside to collect my mail. Among the usual advertisements and utility statements was a plain white envelope with the Oakwood Neighborhood Association logo printed in the corner. Curious, I opened it while standing on my porch. Inside was a letter signed by the HOA president, Michael Reynolds. At first, I assumed it was another administrative update related to the recent investigation. Instead, I found something completely unexpected. The letter thanked me for my cooperation throughout the process. It acknowledged that despite weeks of rumors and public scrutiny, I had remained respectful, patient, and willing to work with city officials. Then came the surprise. The HOA board had unanimously voted to recognize me at the upcoming Community Appreciation Day event. I actually laughed out loud. A month earlier, I had been the subject of complaints. Now the neighborhood association wanted to honor me. Life really does have a strange sense of humor. Later that afternoon, word about the letter spread faster than I would have liked. Several neighbors stopped by to congratulate me. Others jokingly referred to me as Oakwood's most famous resident. Even Mr. Harrison couldn't resist teasing me. Most people get recognized for community service, he said. You managed to do it with trash bins. By the time Community Appreciation Day arrived 2 weeks later, the entire neighborhood seemed determined to leave the drama behind. Families filled the park. Children played games. Food trucks lined the entrance. Local musicians performed under a pavilion decorated with colorful banners. The atmosphere felt lighter than it had in months. More importantly, people were talking to one another again instead of talking about one another. That alone felt like progress. Near the end of the event, Michael Reynolds stepped onto a small stage to thank volunteers and community members. Then he invited me forward. Walking toward that stage felt surreal. I kept thinking about how this entire story started. One complaint. 2 trash bins. One neighbor convinced she was protecting community standards. None of us could have predicted where it would lead. After accepting a small plaque, I was asked to say a few words. Public speaking has never been my favorite thing. But as I looked out at the crowd, the message suddenly felt obvious. I told everyone that neighborhoods are built on trust. Not perfect trust. Not blind trust. Just the willingness to believe that most people are trying their best. I reminded them how easy it is to form opinions from a distance. A photograph. A rumor. A complaint. A quick assumption. But the truth is usually more complicated than the story we first hear. The crowd listened quietly. Some nodded. Others smiled. Then I shared the lesson this experience taught me. Sometimes, I said, we become so focused on finding fault that we stop looking for understanding. The park remained silent for a moment before applause broke out across the audience. It wasn't applause for me. It was applause for a lesson many people had learned together. After the ceremony ended, I noticed Narita standing nearby. For a second, I wasn't sure whether she would approach. Then she did. This time there were no arguments, no complaints, no tension. She simply offered congratulations and asked how Duke was doing. It was a small conversation, but it felt important. Not because we suddenly became close friends. We didn't. But because we had finally reached a place of mutual respect. Sophia joined us a few minutes later, and for the first time in a long while, all 3 of us laughed together. As the evening sun settled over Oakwood, families began heading home. Children carried prizes. Neighbors exchanged goodbyes. Music drifted through the park. Duke collapsed dramatically on the grass after spending the entire afternoon accepting attention from anyone willing to pet him. Watching him, I couldn't help smiling. He had no idea he had become part of one of the strangest stories in neighborhood history. Looking around, I realized the biggest victory wasn't that my name had been cleared. It wasn't the plaque. It wasn't even the apology. The biggest victory was that the community had learned something valuable. A complaint can start a conversation. An assumption can start a conflict. But only the truth can bring people back together. My name is Maya Johnson, and that's how my neighbor reported my trash bins to the city. Only for the investigation to uncover a hidden problem no one had noticed for decades. In the end, the city found no violations on my property. But they found something far more important. A reminder that before we judge our neighbors, we should probably make sure we know the whole story first.